Hey everyone, this would be my 8th vlog in the Sleepy Vlog Countdown, so there's 7 more to go. But this one's inspired by Eric at Longbox Review, his podcast. He does videos, but he also does a audio podcast that's on his blog and also available on iTunes. So I was listening to him in my car. I believe the name of the episode was Chicken Little, and he was kind of pondering his history in comics and the changes recently where all these indie publishers are looking really good right now. And I'm not sure if he came to this conclusion, but in my head I was coming to the conclusion that I could easily not read superhero comics right now, or not read the mainstream big two comics, and have plenty of great stuff to read from a variety of publishers. Image being the strongest one, and then maybe Dark Horse, and some great stuff from IDW and Oni Press, and a variety of others. You can there's enough stuff in nice color comic books that could keep you busy, and you could just give up on Marvel and DC. And so as I was listening to him and his very interesting podcast, which I will link below, I was thinking about my own kind of up and down experiences with superheroes. I mean, I think for most of us who've been reading comics for a long time, or even a medium amount of time, we've probably come and gone from superheroes and from comic books. But for me in particular, I was just thinking of my progress with superheroes, which were obviously my first love in comics. Followed shortly, because I started reading in the mid and late 70s, by some horror and sword and sorcery comics, also published by these mainstream publishers. And what happened is, I remember, part of it was I turned 16 and I wanted to drive and hang out with girls and go to rock concerts. But also I just felt, I was outgrowing comic books and they were kid stuff. And then I stumbled across, I was very lucky, and I stumbled across the very first issue of Frank Miller's Daredevil. It might have been that I don't know what's going on there. Getting big creases here. Total aside, sorry about that. It might have been that I stumbled across a comic book store in my college town where I just started going to college. Would have been the second comic book store I'd ever seen, and they might have recommended Daredevil to me. I can't remember, but I loved it, and it launched me back into superhero comics. So that in the early 80s, thanks to Daredevil, and then later thanks to Swamp Thing, I was just so into comics and all that they could be, that I was just buying tons of them. And certainly in those early 80s, they were easily affordable, even on my low wage summer jobs and the like. And so the Daredevil led me to all kinds of other cool stuff that I might not have noticed without it, which most of you guys know all about. And there was the whole British invasion that we didn't know was quite happening yet, but that was being led by Alan Moore. And throughout the early 80s, things would keep popping up that would really rejuvenate my interest in superheroes, like Walt Simonson's Thor run, which at the time just seemed mind-blowingly good. It now seems dated. And there were interesting independent above ground comics. I mean, there were the underground comics, and I explored all of those too, but there were interesting superhero related comics that were going on also. But I faded out of superhero comics very quickly, right at the beginning of the 90s, even, yeah, right around the time of Image Comics, I stopped reading not only Image, because I immediately disliked Image, but at the time, but also Marvel and DC for the most part. But I did. There was when that huge early '90s boom of comics was happening. There was all kinds of interesting stuff. There were companies like Valiant, which I enjoyed quite a bit, and they were still within the Marvel DC-ish kind of world. But then there was all kinds of alternative comic books abounding, and unfortunately, I don't have many of them anymore, but I got quite a few. This, I think, was just published by a company either called Spider Baby, I think, or Graphics, that I believe was run by Rick Veitch of Swamp Thing fame. And it was one of my favorites. It was a horror anthology of pretty avant-garde stuff. And From Hell came out of here and continued on once, slowly continued on once Taboo went away. And there were all kinds of interesting things from Fantagraphics and I want to say whoever published Chester Brown and Drawn and Quarterly, maybe that was them. And anyway, I don't have most of that stuff. There was also the continuation of a lot of groundwork that Alan Moore had laid. There was all the Fantagraphics stuff. Most embodied by the brothers Hernandez. Dark Horse was coming on strong. There were interesting things like Astro City popping up in the 90s. So there was stuff that I was cherry picking, but I think I occasionally tried some Batman, some Superman. I picked up some other stuff along the way, but I was really focusing more on the Vertigo books, and sort of other things like Vertigo. This was the Helix line that DC did for a while, which I liked quite a bit. It was more pure science fiction, I guess, than the Vertigo line, which had more of a horror kind of vibe. And I remember Planetary sort of jumping out at me. It isn't exactly superheroes, but it kind of revived my interest in what you might call more mainstream comic books. And I hunted out all of that. And I think around the same time, Alan Moore came back to more mainstream work with his America's Best comics, which I believe he stopped. America's Best was actually part of Wildstorm. I think he stopped writing for them when Wildstorm was sold to DC, who he swore never to work for. So you might, this is another total aside, you might say he was kind of betrayed by Jim Lee because he thought he was working with an independent comic book company, and instead he's now part of the umbrella of DC again. I don't know whether he made a mistake again in his contracts, although he's managed to continue the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen separate from DC. So I don't know all of the contractual stuff there, but he was coming out with lots of great stuff. Promethea, Top 10, Tom Strong, as I just showed there, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. I mean, he was a one-man show just doing all kinds of incredible stuff. And that was pulling me back into the comic book stores. Actually, before then, other things would pull me back. Like, I remember the 2099 series, and I would, whenever Jim Starlin would come back and do something, I would pick those up, although I always hated the Ron Lim art. Anyway, so I had mostly drifted away from superhero comics, and Planetary and Alan Moore doing these things kind of pulled me back in and had me looking around. And I think that's where I then came across the Ultimate Universe, which was a really fun reboot of the Marvel Universe while the Marvel Universe was still running. But it was really enjoyable. I think I liked the Ultimates a lot. I really liked the Ultimate Fantastic Four because I was a big Fantastic Four fan when I was a boy, and to see it redone and see all the ways they twisted everything. And another thing that kind of grabbed me in a nostalgic superhero way was the Godland series by Joe Casey and Tom Scioli, where they very purposefully aped Jack Kirby and aped 70s cosmic stories like Jack Kirby and Jim Starlin. It was a lot of fun. I think it still hasn't quite concluded. And then I had, somewhere in there, I had a fallow period of buying any comic books just because I had zero time. Some changes happened in my life. I went through a really busy time. And then my daughter was born. Even before my daughter was born, it was kind of a crazy time. Although I remember during a period before my daughter was born, when I was unemployed and looking for a job, I was watching YouTube videos even back then of people reviewing comics. And then my daughter was born, and I got an iPad, and I started doing a lot of digital comics. And at first I was mostly doing Dark Horse, but slowly exploring what Marvel was offering and a little bit of what DC was offering. And then with the New 52, jumped back into DC in a big way. There was lots of exciting superhero stuff, and done at an angle that I wasn't used to. Maybe DC's probably been, and Marvel have been building up to this for a long time, since the crappy days of the 90s, and then they worked their way back up, became very writer-oriented, etc. So there was lots of good work, and I was really impressed, and I kind of got full-on back into superheroes and other kind of related stuff in the DC universe, and to some extent in the Marvel universe. I mean, there's some great stuff in Marvel. So DC probably, I was cherry picking a little bit of Marvel before then, but DC helped really just pull me in to all kinds of superhero comics, as you guys have seen me reviewing. But of course, also picking up on all this other kind of stuff. So it feels like the tables could turn again. I could just go off into the non-superhero world again. I'm kind of hoping right now that I don't. But as you hear bad things about DC, and then Marvel is so focused on X-Men and DC and Avengers and that kind of thing. I feel like I'm at a wedge point where I could, or a crossroads, sorry, where I could just go very deeply into these kind of mainstream alternative books. They're far less alternative than Taboo was, and that what Fantagraphics used to put out. For one thing, because they're in color and very on slick paper and everything. For another thing, they all employ similar writing devices and sometimes similar art devices, but there's more variety, I think, in the art. But there's a lot of similar devices used in the current superhero comics and in the indie comics. With some exceptions where, you're not going to see art like this yet in the mainstream Marvel and DC. But you do see the writer of this all over Marvel and DC, Matt Kindt. So anyway, I think one thing that, is very noticeable to me from having only slowly edged my way back into superheroes during the 2000s is all the sophisticated stuff that I was only seeing, in something like Planetary or Alan Moore is now everywhere in mainstream comics. And the whole cool stuff that was being done in the Ultimate Universe is now commonly done in the regular universes of Marvel and DC. So, on one hand, the whole world of superhero comics really did become more sophisticated. It was easy to come back to it as an adult and really enjoy it in a lot of ways. But then, as you know, some of the stuff that Eric in his Long Box Review podcast was talking about, some of the extremes of violence, there's some kind of it's a weird mix of this sophistication and then this pandering that at times starts bothering you after a while, after you've been sucked in by some of the sophistication. Both the pandering with all the marketing tricks and stuff, and also too much violence, the even further sexualization of some characters like Starfire and Harley Quinn and the like. So anyway, I think I will continue, but I am more and more in the past 2 years buying more and more of the Image and the Dark Horse, and I'm looking around for more. Maybe I'll get burned too much. I'm very excited about Vertigo, but I was a little disappointed in Hinterkind. I grabbed it, I added it to my pull list, and before I read it. But I'm not sure if I really want to follow Hinterkind, and there may be others. Not Pacific Rim, Great Pacific, I was loving, and I was telling everyone to go out and read it. And then after my little hiatus, when I read 4 issues of Great Pacific or 5 issues of Great Pacific at once, I feel like it's kind of going downhill. It's losing direction. Those are just little examples. So, the indie comics aren't going to be perfect either. The non-superhero comics are not going to be perfect. There's going to be a lot of dead ends there. So it makes for interesting times. And I feel kind of fickle, leaving superheroes, coming back to superheroes, leaving them. But I guess that's just the way it is. Talk to y'all later.